They thought she was just a disposable housewife. They thought they could strip her of her dignity, take every penny, and toss her onto the streets of Manhattan like yesterday's trash. Richard and his ruthless mother laughed as she signed the divorce papers, believing they had won. But they forgot one crucial detail, a secret buried so deep, even the banks didn't see it coming. When the judge finally read her true legal name aloud, the laughter didn't just stop the entire courtroom, froze in terrified silence, because Lydia wasn't who they thought she was, and by the time they realized it, it was already too late. The rain in New York City that Tuesday wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a relentless grey sheet that battered the windows of the penthouse on 57th Street. Inside, the atmosphere was even colder. Lydia stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, staring out at the blurred lights of the city she had helped her husband conquer. Behind her, the sound of a zipper sealing a suitcase cut through the silence like a knife. "I want you out by 5, Richard said. His voice was devoid of emotion, the same tone he used when firing an underperforming junior analyst at his firm, Sterling and Halloway. "The driver will take you to a motel in Queens. I've paid for 3 nights. After that, you're on your own." Lydia didn't turn around immediately. She watched her reflection in the glass. Pale, tired, wearing a simple beige cardigan that had seen better days. She looked nothing like the wife of a man who had just closed a $40 million merger with a Japanese tech giant. 3 nights, Lydia repeated softly. 10 years, Richard. And I get 3 nights in a motel? Richard laughed, a short, sharp bark. He was pouring himself a glass of Macallan 25, the crystal decanter clinking against the glass. He didn't even offer her water. "Be grateful it's not the street," a sharp voice cut in from the hallway. Beatrice, Richard's mother, marched into the room. She was a woman who wore her wealth like armor. A vintage Chanel suit, a string of Mikimoto pearls, and a face pulled tight by the best surgeons in Zurich. She held a manila envelope as if it were a weapon. "You signed the prenup, Lydia," Beatrice sneered, tossing the envelope onto the marble coffee table. "You were a waitress when Richard found you. You brought nothing into this marriage, and strictly speaking, you're entitled to nothing coming out of it. We are being generous." Lydia turned then. Her eyes were dry. She had cried all her tears 3 months ago when she found the second phone in Richard's briefcase. The texts from Jessica, PR, had been explicit, brutal, and humiliating. But when she had confronted him, Richard hadn't apologized. He had simply accelerated the divorce. "I built this company with him," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "When we started, Richard, you were working out of a garage in Jersey. Who wrote the business plan? Who stayed up until 4 a.m. editing your pitch decks for the investors at J.P. Morgan? Who leveraged their own credit card to pay for the first servers?" "Ancient history," Richard scoffed, taking a sip of the scotch. He adjusted his silk tie, looking at his Rolex Daytona as if she were wasting his valuable time. "I did the work. I made the deals. You just kept the coffee warm. And let's be honest, Lydia, you've let yourself go. A man in my position needs a partner who looks the part. Jessica understands the modern market. She fits the image." "Jessica is 22, Lydia said quietly. "And she has an MBA, Beatrice snapped. "Unlike you. You're a liability, Lydia. You're plain, you're uneducated, and frankly, you're an embarrassment to the Halloway name." Beatrice walked over to the suitcase the maid had packed, a single, medium-sized bag. "We've allowed you to keep your clothes. The jewelry stays. The car stays. The cards have already been cancelled as of—" She checked her diamond-encrusted watch. 10 minutes ago. Lydia looked at the man she had loved for a decade. He wouldn't even meet her eyes. He was scrolling through his phone, likely texting Jessica about dinner reservations at Le Bernardin. "You're making a mistake, Richard," Lydia said. It wasn't a threat. It sounded like a statement of fact. Richard finally looked up, a smirk playing on his lips. "The only mistake I made was not doing this 5 years ago. Sign the settlement, Lydia. It's a waiver. You get $10,000 cash, and you waive all rights to future claims on Sterling and Halloway or my personal assets. If you don't sign, I'll bury you in legal fees until you starve." He uncapped a Mont Blanc pen and set it on the document. Lydia looked at the paper. Waiver of spousal support and equitable distribution. It was a death sentence for her future. $10,000 in New York City wouldn't last 2 months. But she looked at Beatrice, whose eyes were gleaming with malicious triumph. She looked at Richard, who was already mentally moving on. Lydia walked to the table. She didn't read the text. She picked up the pen. "Smart girl," Beatrice purred. "Back to the gutter you go." Lydia signed her name, but she didn't sign it Lydia Halloway. She signed it with a flourish that Richard, in his arrogance, didn't bother to check closely. She set the pen down. "I'll leave now." "Don't forget your umbrella," Richard called out mockingly as she walked toward the elevator. "I wouldn't want you to drown before you get to Queens." The elevator doors closed, shutting out the sight of the gold-leafed foyer and the husband who had just discarded her like a wrapper. As the lift descended 40 floors, Lydia didn't cry. She reached into her pocket and touched a small, cold metal object she had retrieved from the safe earlier that morning, a simple silver USB drive. They thought she was leaving with nothing. But Lydia was leaving with the one thing money couldn't buy: memory and patience. The motel in Queens was exactly as Richard had promised: damp, smelling of stale cigarettes, and vibrating every time the subway train rattled overhead. Lydia sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. It was a stark contrast to the Egyptian cotton sheets she had woken up in that morning. She opened her banking app on her phone. Account balance. The joint accounts were locked. The credit cards were dead. She had the $10,000 in a cashier's check in her pocket, but she couldn't deposit it yet. To deposit it meant accepting the terms, and Lydia had a plan that required her to be very, very careful. For the first 2 weeks, she lived off cheap bodega sandwiches and instant coffee. She needed a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. She needed a shark, but sharks cost money, and Richard had blacklisted her. She had visited 3 firms in Manhattan. At Cravath, Swain and Moore, the receptionist had politely told her they were conflicted out. Richard had evidently paid retainers to the top 5 divorce firms in the city just to ensure she couldn't hire them. It was a classic, brutal tactic. Defeated, Lydia sat on a park bench in Bryant Park, watching the bustle of the city. She felt invisible. A woman in a worn coat, overlooked by the titans of industry marching past in their tailored suits. "Is this seat taken?" Lydia looked up. An elderly man with a cane and a slightly fraying tweed jacket stood there. He held a brown paper bag and a cup of tea. "No," Lydia said, shifting over. The man sat. He pulled a sandwich out of the bag. "Rough day?" he asked, noting her posture. Lydia let out a dry laugh. "Rough life. My husband just divorced me. He owns half the city, and I can't even get a lawyer to return my call." The old man chewed slowly. "Husband sounds like a charmer. Who is he?" "Richard Halloway." The old man stopped chewing. He turned to look at her, his eyes surprisingly sharp behind thick spectacles. "Halloway? The hedge fund boy? Sterling and Halloway?" "That's the one." "Arrogant prick," the man grumbled. "He shorted a medical supply company last year, bankrupted them, put 3,000 people out of work just to make a quick 12% on the quarter. Lydia looked at him, surprised. You follow the market? I read, the man said simply. I'm Arthur Penhaligon. Lydia? Well, Lydia, Arthur said, crumbling his sandwich wrapper. Why can't you get a lawyer? Halloway isn't God. His retainer blocked everyone. I have no access to funds. He froze me out. Arthur hummed. He reached into his tweed pocket and pulled out a business card. It wasn't fancy. It was plain white cardstock with black text, no logo. It read, Tobias Vance, attorney at law, and a phone number, no address. Call him, Arthur said. He hates bullies, and he hates Richard Halloway. Lydia took the card, skeptical. Is he expensive? For you? Arthur winked. He might be free. Depends on how good your story is. Lydia called the number that afternoon. The voice on the other end was deep and gravelly. When she mentioned Richard Halloway, there was a pause, and then an address was given. Not a glass tower in Manhattan, but a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. Tobias Vance was a bear of a man, messy and intense, with an office buried under stacks of case files. He listened to Lydia for 2 hours. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look at his watch. When she finished explaining the prenup, the $10,000 settlement, and the way Beatrice had laughed, Tobias leaned back in his creaking leather chair. They think you're weak, Tobias said. They think because you were a waitress, you don't understand the game. I understand the game, Lydia said, her voice hardening. I taught him the game. Richard is good at talking, Mr. Vance, but he's terrible at math. I did the books for the first 4 years. I know where the bodies are buried. Tobias smiled, showing teeth. And do you have proof? Lydia reached into her purse and placed the silver USB drive on his desk. This contains the unredacted ledgers from 2018 to 2024, she said, including the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that he forgot to declare to the IRS, and the shell company, Blue Heron Holdings, that he uses to funnel money to his mother. Tobias picked up the drive as if it were a diamond. Lydia, this isn't just a divorce case. This is a nuclear bomb. I don't want to destroy him, Lydia said, though her eyes suggested otherwise. I just want what is fair. But he made it clear. He wants war. War it is, Tobias said. But we have a problem. The court date he set. It's in 3 days. He rushed the docket. He wants to ambush you before you get representation. We have 72 hours to build a defense against a billion-dollar legal team. I don't need a defense, Lydia said, standing up. I need an offense. And there is something else you need to know. Something Richard doesn't know. What's that? Lydia hesitated. She looked around the dusty office, at the law degrees on the wall that were crooked. My name, she said softly. On the marriage certificate, I used my stepfather's name, Lydia Miller. It's the name I've used my whole adult life since I ran away from home at 18. Okay, Tobias said slowly. But I never legally changed it, Lydia said. My birth certificate, my passport, and the trust fund that matures on my 30th birthday, which is next week, they are all under my father's name. Tobias leaned in. And who was your father, Lydia? She whispered a name. Tobias Vance, a man who had seen everything in 30 years of law, dropped his pen. It rolled off the desk and hit the floor with a clatter. Good God, he breathed. Does Richard know? No, Lydia said. He never asked about my family. He thought I was trash. He never cared enough to look. Tobias let out a low, rumbling laugh that shook his chest. Lydia, we aren't going to just win. We are going to put on a show. When we walk into that courtroom, I want you to wear the most expensive dress you own. Do you have one? I have the dress I wore to the Met Gala 2 years ago. Beatrice made me put it in storage because she said it outshined her. Wear it, Tobias ordered. See you in court. The morning of the hearing, the sky over Manhattan had cleared, leaving a crisp, blinding blue that felt judgmental. The New York Supreme Court on Center Street was bustling, a hive of misery and litigation. Richard Halloway arrived in a black Escalade. He stepped out, flanked by 3 lawyers from Skadden Arps. He looked like a man who had already won. His suit was a custom charcoal Tom Ford, and his demeanor was relaxed, bordering on bored. Beatrice was with him naturally. She wore a severe navy suit and a hat that looked like a bird of prey perched on her head. Hanging on Richard's arm was Jessica, the 22-year-old PR intern. She looked nervous, clutching a designer bag that was clearly a recent gift, her eyes darting around at the paparazzi Richard had accidentally tipped off. "Just smile, Jessica," Richard murmured, adjusting his cufflinks. "It'll be over in 20 minutes. The judge, Honorable Silas Thorne, is a golf buddy of mine. We'll just formalize the waiver, humiliate Lydia a bit for the record, and then we go to lunch at Per Se." "Is she even going to show up?" Jessica asked, chewing her lip. "You said she has no money." "She'll show up to beg," Beatrice cackled. "She has no pride." Inside courtroom 402, the atmosphere was stifling. The wood-paneled walls seemed to absorb the light. Richard's legal team spread out over the plaintiff's table like an oil slick, opening sleek laptops and stacking leather-bound binders. They laughed among themselves, sharing inside jokes about summer homes in the Hamptons. On the defendant's side, the table was empty. The gallery was surprisingly full. Word had gotten out that the CEO of Sterling and Halloway was finalizing a high-profile divorce. Junior bankers, gossip columnists, and curious onlookers packed the benches. 5 minutes past the hour, Richard's lead attorney, a man named Marcus Stone, a shark in a 3-piece suit, announced loudly, "Your Honor, the defendant is absent. We move for a default judgment." Judge Thorne, a heavy-set man with a red face, peered over his glasses. "It is rather late, Mr. Stone. I'm inclined to—" Creak. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound was loud enough to cut through the murmur of the crowd. Heads turned. Richard didn't bother looking back. He just rolled his eyes. Finally, the stray cat returns. But the silence that swept through the room made him pause. It wasn't the silence of pity. It was the silence of awe. Lydia walked in. She was not wearing the beige cardigan or the worn jeans she had left the penthouse in. She was wearing the dress. It was a structured architectural piece of midnight blue silk that fit her like a second skin, high-necked but backless, radiating a kind of regal power that sucked the air out of the room. She wore no jewelry except for a pair of vintage sapphire earrings that caught the courtroom lights. Her hair, usually tied back in a messy bun, was loose, cascading in polished waves. But it wasn't just the dress. It was the way she walked. She didn't scurry. She glided. Her chin was up, her eyes cool and detached. Behind her walked Tobias Vance. The rumpled lawyer had cleaned up, slightly. He wore a suit that was 20 years out of style, but pressed, and he carried a battered briefcase that looked like it had survived a war. Richard stared. For a second, he forgot Jessica existed. He had never seen Lydia look like this. She looked expensive. "Sorry we're late, Your Honor," Tobias rumbled, his voice echoing off the walls. "Traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge is a nightmare." Lydia took her seat at the defense table. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't look at Beatrice. She opened a bottle of water, poured a glass, and took a sip. "You look ridiculous," Beatrice hissed across the aisle, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She seemed unsettled. "Spending your last dime on a dress won't save you." Lydia turned her head slowly. She offered Beatrice a small, pitying smile. "Hello, Beatrice. I see you're still wearing that brooch I told you was a fake." Beatrice gasped, clutching the pearl cluster on her lapel. "How dare you!" "Order!" Judge Thorne banged his gavel. "Mr. Stone, proceed." Marcus Stone stood up, buttoning his jacket. He launched into his opening statement, a rehearsed speech about Richard's brilliance and Lydia's irrelevance. "Your Honor," Stone droned, pacing the floor. "This case is simple. We have a prenuptial agreement signed 10 years ago. We have a waiver of assets signed 2 weeks ago. The plaintiff, Mr. Halloway, is the sole generator of wealth in this union. The defendant, Mrs. Halloway, was a waitress with no assets, no education, and no contribution to the firm Sterling and Halloway. We ask that the court enforce the signed waiver, grant the divorce, and remove the defendant from the premises immediately." Richard leaned back, crossing his legs. He smirked at Lydia. "Checkmate." "Mr. Vance?" the judge asked, looking bored. "Do you have anything to say before I rule?" Tobias Vance stood up slowly. He didn't have notes. He didn't have a laptop. He just leaned his knuckles on the table. "Your Honor," Tobias said, "my colleague, Mr. Stone, tells a compelling story. A story of a self-made man and a gold-digging nobody. It's a classic American tale." He paused, looking directly at Richard. "But there is a flaw in the paperwork. A technicality, if you will." "We checked the paperwork 3 times, Stone snapped. "The signatures are valid." "The signatures are physically on the paper, yes," Tobias agreed. "But the identity of the signer is legally ambiguous." "Ambiguous?" Judge Thorne frowned. "Is she Lydia Halloway or not?" "She is," Tobias said, "but she is also someone else, and that someone else has rights that supersede Mr. Halloway's claim to the company." Richard laughed out loud. "Rights? She doesn't even own a car." Tobias ignored him. He picked up a single piece of paper from his battered briefcase. "Mr. Halloway," Tobias said, turning to Richard, "you are the CEO of Sterling and Halloway, correct?" "I am." "And the Halloway is you." "Obviously." "And the Sterling?" Tobias asked. "Who is the Sterling?" Richard scoffed. "Arthur Sterling. He was a silent investor who put up the capital 20 years ago. He died in 2015. I bought out his estate. I own the whole thing." "Did you?" Tobias asked softly. "Did you buy out his estate?" "Yes. I paid his executors $5 million for his shares." "You paid a shell company," Tobias corrected. "You paid Blue Heron Holdings, which you actually own, to make it look like you bought the shares. But the real Sterling shares, the controlling 51% interest in the firm, those were never sold. They were held in a trust." The room went quiet. Richard's smile faltered. "That's a lie. Sterling had no family, no heirs." "Arthur Sterling had 1 daughter," Tobias said. "She ran away from home at 18 because she wanted to make it on her own, without Daddy's money. She changed her name. She waited tables. She fell in love with a young, ambitious man and helped him build a company, thinking they were partners." Tobias turned to Lydia. "Stand up, Lydia." Lydia stood. The blue silk rippled. "Your Honor," Tobias boomed, his voice shaking the rafters, "I present to you the defendant. Her legal name is not Lydia Miller. It is not even Lydia Halloway." He held up a birth certificate. "Her name is Lydia Sterling, daughter of Arthur Sterling, and the sole beneficiary of the Sterling Trust, which owns 51% of Mr. Halloway's company." The silence that followed was heavy, physical. It pressed down on the courtroom like a lead blanket. Richard Halloway's face went from flushed to a ghostly, sickly white. The pen he was holding slipped from his fingers and rolled across the mahogany table, the sound amplified in the quiet room. Click, click, click. Beatrice looked as if she had been slapped. Her mouth opened, closed and opened again, but no sound came out. She looked at Lydia, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw the resemblance, the high cheekbones, the specific shade of steel-grey eyes. That's impossible, Richard stammered. He stood up, knocking his chair over. This is a trick. Arthur Sterling's daughter died. That was the rumour. She was gone. She was in Queens, Lydia said. Her voice was calm, melodic, and terrifyingly cold. Waitressing at a diner while you sat in my father's office. Objection! Stone shouted, though he sounded panicked. Relevance, even if she is who she claims. She signed the prenup. She signed the waiver. She waived her assets. Tobias Vance smiled. It was the smile of a wolf who had cornered a rabbit. Ah, the waiver, Tobias said. Mr. Stone, you are a partner at Skadden. Surely you know the law regarding fraudulent inducement and non-disclosure of assets? Stone froze. When Mr. Halloway presented the prenup 10 years ago, Tobias continued, pacing toward the judge, he listed his assets. He claimed he owned 100% of the company. But if Lydia is the Sterling heir, then he never owned 100%. He was managing her shares without her knowledge. He committed fraud on the financial disclosure. Tobias slammed his hand on the railing, and the waiver signed 2 weeks ago. Lydia signed it under duress after being thrown out of her home. But more importantly, she signed it as Lydia Halloway. But the assets in question, the Sterling shares, belong to Lydia Sterling. A waiver signed by a persona cannot surrender the rights of the trust. Judge Thorne was flipping through the documents Tobias had handed up. His face was pale. He looked at Richard. Mr. Halloway, the judge said, his voice low. Did you know? No, Richard screamed. I swear, I didn't know. She lied to me. She hid her identity. I didn't lie, Lydia interjected smoothly. You never asked. In 10 years, Richard, you never asked me a single question about my childhood. You were too busy talking about yourself. This is insane, Beatrice screeched, standing up. She's a fraud. Look at her. She's a waitress. Sit down, Mrs. Halloway, the bailiff warned, stepping forward. Lydia turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have more. She pulled the silver USB drive from her clutch. Because I was the bookkeeper for the first 4 years, Lydia said, and because I have a photographic memory for numbers, a trait I inherited from my father, I noticed some discrepancies. She walked to the clerk and handed over the drive. This drive contains evidence that Richard Halloway has been embezzling from the Sterling Trust for 6 years. He's been siphoning profits that legally belong to the majority shareholder, me, into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands under his mother's name. Beatrice let out a strangled sound and slumped back into her seat. He used company funds to buy the penthouse, Lydia continued. He used company funds to pay for his mistress's apartment in Soho, and he used company funds to pay for these expensive lawyers. Lydia turned to face the gallery, then looked directly into the camera of a journalist who was surreptitiously filming. Technically, Lydia said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips, he's been using my money to try and divorce me. Richard looked at his lawyers. Do something. Marcus Stone closed his laptop. He started packing his bag. Where are you going? Richard hissed. Mr. Halloway, Stone whispered harshly. If half of what she says is true, you are going to federal prison. I cannot represent a client who has committed perjury and grand larceny in my presence. You're on your own. The 3 lawyers from Skadden stood up and walked out. The heavy doors swung shut behind them. Richard was left standing alone. The courtroom was buzzing now. The reporters were typing furiously on their phones. The story was already breaking. Waitress revealed as billionaire heiress. Halloway empire crumbles. Judge Thorne looked down at Richard with pure disgust. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, "what is your motion?" "We move to freeze all assets immediately," Tobias said. "We move to annul the prenup on the grounds of fraud. And we move for an immediate restraining order, preventing Mr. Halloway or his mother from entering the premises of Sterling and Halloway." "Granted," the judge said instantly. The gavel came down. Bang! "Wait!" Richard cried, desperate now, sweat pouring down his face. He looked at Lydia. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a pathetic, clawing need. "Lydia, honey, please, we can talk about this. I didn't mean the prenup. It was just business. I love you. You know I love you." Jessica, the mistress, stood up slowly. She looked at Richard, then at Lydia. She saw the power dynamic shift in real time. "I think I'm going to go," Jessica mumbled. She dropped the designer bag on the floor and bolted for the exit. Lydia walked over to Richard. She stood inches from him. He smelled of fear and expensive cologne. "You love me?" she asked softly. "Yes. Yes, I do. We were a team, Lydia. We built this." "No," Lydia said. "I built it. You just spent it." She leaned in closer, so only he could hear. "You gave me 3 nights in a motel, Richard. I'm going to give you something more generous. I'm giving you 3 minutes to get out of my building before I call security." "Your building?" "I'm the majority shareholder," Lydia said, her voice freezing the air in his lungs. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting in 1 hour. You're fired." Richard slumped into his chair, head in his hands. Beatrice was weeping, clutching her pearls, muttering about her reputation. Lydia turned and walked toward the aisle. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Tobias winked at her as she passed. She walked out of the courtroom into the flash of cameras, her head held high. But the drama wasn't over. Richard wasn't the type to go down without a dirty fight. And there was still one secret Lydia hadn't played, the one that would destroy his reputation not just as a businessman, but as a man. The lobby of the Sterling and Halloway Tower in Midtown Manhattan was a cathedral of glass and steel. For 10 years, Lydia had walked through these doors as an invisible woman. The receptionists would barely look up. The security guards would offer a half-hearted nod, knowing she held no real power. Today, the air in the lobby shifted the moment the revolving doors spun. Lydia didn't enter alone. She was flanked by Tobias Vance, who looked surprisingly menacing now that he was on the winning side, and a team of 4 forensic accountants she had hired an hour ago. The head of security, a burly man named Frank, who had once refused to let Lydia up because she'd forgotten her keycard, stepped forward. He looked nervous. His earpiece was buzzing with chatter from upstairs. "Mrs. Halloway," Frank stammered, blocking the turnstile. "I have orders from Mr. Halloway. He said you're not allowed in the building. He said there was a disturbance at court." Lydia stopped. She looked at Frank. She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. She simply reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded court order, stamped with the seal of the New York Supreme Court. "Frank," Lydia said, her voice level, "I am not Mrs. Halloway. I am Lydia Sterling. And as of 45 minutes ago, I am the chairwoman of the board. If you value your pension, you will step aside. If you prefer to stay loyal to a man who is currently vomiting in a courthouse bathroom, you can hand in your badge, right now." Frank looked at the paper. He looked at the determined set of her jaw. He looked at the paparazzi gathering outside the glass. He stepped aside and swiped his MasterCard. "Elevator A is waiting, Ms. Sterling." The ride to the 50th floor was silent. Lydia watched the floor numbers tick up, 10, 20, 30. With every passing floor, she felt the weight of the last decade shedding. The late nights she had spent proofreading documents while Richard slept. The dinners where she had been silenced. The way he had made her feel small so he could feel big. Ping. The doors opened onto the executive floor. The office was in chaos. Phones were ringing off the hook. Secretaries were huddled in whispers. When Lydia walked down the central corridor, the noise died instantly. She walked straight to the main conference room, the war room, where the emergency board meeting was already assembling. She pushed the double doors open. Around the long mahogany table sat 12 men and 2 women. These were the investors, the silent partners, the people who had enabled Richard's arrogance because he made them money. They looked up, startled. Richard's chair at the head of the table was empty. "Gentlemen, ladies," Lydia said, tossing her clutch onto the table. "Please remain seated." "Lydia?" sputtered George Abernathy, a man who had been Richard's mentor. "What is the meaning of this? Richard called us. He said you've gone insane. He said you're trying to destroy the firm." "I'm saving the firm, George," Lydia said. She walked to the head of the table, Richard's seat. She didn't sit. She stood behind it, gripping the leather. "Richard isn't coming. He has been suspended pending a federal investigation into embezzlement and fraud." A gasp went around the room. "Embezzlement?" George asked, his face reddening. "That's a serious accusation." "It is," Tobias Vance said, stepping forward and dropping a stack of files in the center of the table. "Here are the transfers. Blue Heron Holdings, Red Line Consulting, Valkyrie LLC, all shell companies registered to Richard Halloway and Beatrice Halloway. Over the last 5 years, they have drained $42 million from this company's liquidity." The board members lunged for the papers, flipping through them frantically. "He was gambling with your money," Lydia said. "And he was doing it using my inheritance as collateral." She looked around the room. "I am taking immediate control as interim CEO. My first act is to freeze all discretionary spending. My second act is to initiate a full external audit. And my third act..." She pressed the intercom button on the table phone. "Security?" "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" "Mr. Halloway has just entered the building," Lydia said, watching the security feed on the wall monitor. "Please escort him to the lobby. Do not let him up. If he resists, call the NYPD." "Copy that." The board members stared at her. They had known her as the quiet wife who brought coffee. Now, she was dismantling the king. "Lydia," George said, his voice trembling slightly. "You don't have the experience to run a firm like this. The markets will panic. We need stability." "Stability?" Lydia laughed, a sharp sound. "You think Richard was stable?" "Richard was a child playing with fire. I know the accounts better than anyone in this room. I know that the Q3 projections were inflated. I know that the merger with the Japanese tech giant is built on bad code. I know because I read the diligence reports that Richard threw in the trash." She leaned forward. "The markets will not panic, George, because tomorrow morning I am going to announce that Sterling and Halloway is returning to its roots: ethical investing, transparency, the values my father, Arthur Sterling, built this place on. If you don't like it, you can sell your shares. I'll buy them." Silence. Complete, respectful silence. Then, slowly, George Abernathy nodded. Motioned to appoint Lydia Sterling as interim CEO. "Seconded," said a woman at the end of the table. "Passed," George said. Lydia sat down in the leather chair. It was comfortable. It felt like it finally fit. But the victory wasn't clean yet. The door to the conference room banged open. It wasn't Richard. It was Jessica, the mistress. She looked disheveled. Her mascara was running. She wasn't carrying the designer bag anymore. "Lydia!" she cried, breathless. "Lydia, please! You have to help me!" Tobias stepped in front of Lydia. "Miss, you need to leave." "No," Jessica sobbed. "Richard, he just called me. He's crazy. He cancelled the cards he gave me. He said I'm the reason he lost focus. He's threatening to release private photos of me if I don't give him back the jewelry." Lydia looked at the young woman. She saw herself 10 years ago, naive, manipulated, believing that a powerful man was the answer to her problems. "He's a narcissist, Jessica," Lydia said calmly. "When they lose control, they attack the easiest target. That's you." "I know," Jessica wept. "I'm sorry. I didn't know he was stealing. I wanted to be someone." Lydia stood up and walked over to the girl who had helped destroy her marriage. She should have felt hate. Instead, she felt a profound, icy indifference. "You wanted his life, Jessica," Lydia said. "Now you have the reality of it. Richard destroys everything he touches." Lydia pulled a card from her pocket. Not a credit card, but a business card for a women's shelter and legal aid clinic. "Go here, ask for Sarah. Tell her I sent you. She'll help you get a restraining order against Richard. But never come back to this building. If I see you here again, I will have you arrested for trespassing." Jessica took the card, her hands shaking. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." She ran out. Lydia turned back to the window. Down on the street, she could see a tiny figure being wrestled into a police car. It was Richard. He had tried to fight security. "Meeting adjourned," Lydia said. 3 months later. The penthouse on 57th Street was quiet. Lydia had remodeled. The cold marble and black leather that Richard loved were gone, replaced by warm woods, soft textiles, and art that actually meant something. But peace was a fragile thing. Richard was out on bail. His lawyers had managed to delay the trial, claiming mental distress. He was living with his mother, Beatrice, in a small apartment in New Jersey, having been evicted from every property in the city. Lydia knew it wasn't over. Men like Richard didn't just fade away. They festered. She was working late in her home office when her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Hello? You think you've won?" a voice hissed. It was raspy, slurred. "Richard." Lydia didn't flinch. She hit the record button on her screen. "Richard, you're violating your bail conditions by calling me." "Screw the bail!" he screamed. "You stole my life, Lydia. You stole my company." "I took back what was mine," she corrected. "What do you want?" "I want a deal," Richard said, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "I have something, Lydia. You think you're so clean. You think Arthur Sterling was a saint?" Lydia gripped the phone. "What are you talking about?" "Your father." Richard laughed darkly. "I went through the old archives, the physical ones in the basement. I found a ledger from 1998, the Sterling Protocol. You know what that is?" Lydia felt a chill. She didn't know. He didn't just invest, Lydia. He laundered. For the cartels. For the mob. That's how he built the seed capital. If I release these documents, the SEC seizes everything. The company goes bankrupt. You go to prison as the beneficiary of dirty money. You lose everything. "You're lying," Lydia said, though her heart hammered. "Meet me," Richard said. "The old warehouse in the meat-packing district, the one the company still owns. Tonight? Midnight. Bring $2 million in crypto, or I leak it to the New York Times tomorrow morning." The line went dead. Lydia sat in the silence. It was a classic Richard move. Desperation. Blackmail. She called Tobias. "Don't go," Tobias said immediately. "It's a trap. He's wearing a wire or he's going to hurt you. Let the police handle it." "If the documents are real," Lydia said, "and the police see them, the company collapses. Thousands of employees lose their jobs. My father's legacy is destroyed." "Lydia, Arthur was a tough businessman, but laundering, I don't buy it. I have to know, Lydia said. I have to see the papers. Then I'm coming with you. No, he'll spook. I'll go. But I'm not going unarmed. Lydia opened the safe in her desk. She didn't take a gun. She took a small, high-tech tracking device and slipped it into the lining of her coat. She then initiated a transfer of funds to a dummy account that looked real, but could be reversed in seconds. At midnight, the meatpacking district was desolate. Cobblestones glistened under the street lamps. The warehouse loomed, a relic of old New York. Lydia pushed the rusty side door open. The interior was cavernous, smelling of oil and dust. "Richard?" "Over here." He was standing under a single hanging bulb. He looked terrible. Unshaven, wearing a stained suit, his eyes wild. He held a thick folder in one hand and a lighter in the other. "You came," he sneered. "Smart girl. Where's the money?" "Show me the proof," Lydia said, stopping 10 feet away. Richard threw the folder at her feet. Lydia knelt and opened it. She scanned the pages. They were old spreadsheets, handwriting that looked like her father's, entries labeled Sinaloa and Cali. Her stomach dropped. It looked real. "He was a crook, Lydia," Richard spat. "Just like me. We're all crooks. Now transfer the money." Lydia looked closer at the documents. She squinted. The paper was yellowed, yes, but the font on the typed headers, it was Calibri. Lydia stood up slowly. A strange calm washed over her. "Calibri," she said. "What?" Richard blinked. "This font," Lydia said, holding up the page. "It's Calibri. Microsoft released this font in 2007. My father died in 2015, but these ledgers are dated 1998. In 1998, everyone used Times New Roman or Arial." Richard froze. The lighter shook in his hand. "You forged these," Lydia said, her voice filled with contempt. "You didn't even do a good job. You probably printed these on Beatrice's inkjet printer this afternoon and dipped them in tea to make them look old. That's why they smell like Earl Grey." "Shut up!" Richard screamed. He lunged at her. But Lydia didn't move, because from the shadows of the warehouse, 3 figures stepped out. "Police! Drop it!" Flashlights blinded Richard. He stumbled back, shielding his eyes. "You called them?" Richard gasped, looking at Lydia with betrayal. "I didn't," Lydia said calmly. "I called the FBI, because blackmailing a federal witness across state lines, that's a whole new charge, Richard." Agents swarmed him. He was tackled to the concrete, screaming obscenities. Lydia watched as they cuffed him. As they dragged him past her, he looked up, tears streaming down his face. "I made you," he sobbed. "I made you who you are." Lydia looked down at him. "No, Richard. You made me hide who I was. And now, I'm finally free." 1 year later, they called it the Fall of Rome in the financial tabloids. But for Lydia, it felt more like an exorcism. The trial of Richard Halloway had consumed the New York news cycle for 6 grueling months. It was a spectacle that eclipsed even the most sensational celebrity divorces. The Calibri Gate scandal, as the press dubbed the forged font incident, became a late-night talk show punchline, stripping Richard of the one thing he valued more than money, his intelligence. He wasn't just painted as a criminal, he was painted as a fool. Lydia sat in the back row on the day of the sentencing. She didn't need to be there, but she needed to see it finished. She watched as Richard, gaunt and grey-skinned, stood before the federal judge. The arrogance that had once filled penthouses and boardrooms had evaporated, leaving behind a shivering, hollow man. "Mr. Halloway," the judge intoned, his voice echoing in the packed chamber. "You were entrusted with a legacy you didn't build, and you used it to steal from the very person who supported you. Your greed was matched only by your hubris." When the gavel fell, 15 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and attempted extortion. Richard didn't scream. He simply slumped forward, his forehead hitting the defendant's table with a dull thud. He didn't look back at the gallery. He didn't look for Lydia. He knew, finally, that she was out of his reach. Beatrice fared little better. The asset forfeiture teams were ruthless. They descended on the Upper East Side apartment, tagging everything from the Chagall paintings to the silver tea service. Lydia heard from a mutual acquaintance that Beatrice had been caught trying to sew diamond earrings into the lining of her mink coat while the FBI waited in her foyer. Stripped of her status and terrified of being indicted as a co-conspirator, Beatrice fled the country 2 days before her passport was set to be flagged. Rumors placed her in a run-down villa in Paraguay, a non-extradition country, where she reportedly spent her days complaining to the local housekeeper about the humidity and the lack of proper afternoon tea. She was a queen without a kingdom, ruling over nothing but dust and mosquitoes. With the parasites gone, Lydia turned her attention to the host. Resurrecting the company was harder than destroying it. The toxicity of the Holloway era had seeped into the drywall. The culture at the firm was one of fear, backstabbing, and short-term profit-chasing. Lydia spent the first 3 months doing nothing but firing people. She fired the bros who spent their afternoons playing golf while their assistants did the work. She fired the compliance officers who had looked the other way when Richard moved millions offshore. She gutted the executive floor, removing the private cigar lounge and the Scotch bar, replacing them with collaborative workspaces and quiet rooms. She worked 18-hour days, fueled not by desperation, but by purpose. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding. She wasn't Lydia Miller, the waitress, or Lydia Holloway, the trophy wife. She was just Lydia, and she was terrifyingly good at her job. On the 1-year anniversary of the divorce filing, the sky over Manhattan opened up. It was a torrential downpour, a grey curtain of a rain that lashed against the skyscrapers. It reminded Lydia of the day she had been thrown out with a single suitcase, told she would drown before she reached Queens. She stood on the sidewalk of 57th Street, protected by a large black umbrella held by Frank, her head of security. Frank had been the one to block her entry a year ago. Now he would take a bullet for her. He had seen how she treated the janitorial staff with the same respect she gave the investors, and that loyalty was ironclad. A crowd had gathered despite the weather. It was a sea of umbrellas, flashing cameras, and curious onlookers. The employees of the firm stood in the front rows, their faces bright with genuine pride, not the forced sycophancy of the old days. Lydia wore a white trench coat, a stark contrast to the gloom. She looked up at the facade of the building. The granite was scarred. The holes where the bronze letters Sterling and Holloway had once been mounted were filled in, but the ghost of the name remained, if you looked closely enough. It served as a reminder. Scars don't disappear, but you can build over them. Next to Lydia stood the new vice president, Elena, a brilliant young analyst Lydia had plucked from the obscurity of the mailroom after reading a paper Elena had written on ethical microfinancing. "Are you ready, Ms. Sterling?" Elena asked, shouting over the sound of the rain and the traffic. "I've been ready for 10 years, Lydia replied. She stepped up to the podium. The microphone screeched briefly before settling. "Thank you all for coming," Lydia said. Her voice was strong, amplified across the block. "A year ago, I stood on this sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on my back. I was told I had no value. I was told I didn't belong in this world." She paused, looking directly into the lens of a news camera. "But value isn't determined by your title, or your husband, or your bank account. Value is what you build when everything else is stripped away. This building used to be a monument to ego. From today on, It is a monument to integrity. We are wiping the slate clean." Lydia turned to the massive silk sheet covering the entrance signage. She took the large ceremonial scissors in her hands. The cold metal felt grounding. 3, 2, 1. Snip. The red silk fluttered down, heavy with rain, pooling on the wet concrete. The new letters gleamed in gold, bold and unpretentious against the dark stone. Sterling Capital. There was no partner. No and. No man taking credit for the late nights and the brilliant strategies. Just her name, her father's name, a legacy reclaimed from the ashes. The crowd erupted. Applause thundered, mixing with the sound of the rain. Champagne corks popped under the awnings. Lydia smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. But as her eyes scanned the crowd, they snagged on a figure standing at the very back, near a hot dog cart. It was an old man in a fraying tweed jacket, leaning heavily on a cane, chewing slowly on a pretzel. Arthur Penhaligon. The stranger from the park. The man who had given her the card that changed her life. Lydia handed the scissors to Eleanor and stepped off the podium. She walked through the parting crowd, ignoring the reporters shouting questions about Richard's prison sentence. She walked straight to the edge of the curb. "You look good, kid," Arthur said, wiping mustard from his lip. "Better than the day on the bench. You got some color in your cheeks." "I feel better," Lydia admitted, the rain misting on her face. "I looked for you. I wanted to invite you to the gala, but the number on the card was disconnected." Tobias retired. Arthur shrugged. "Moved to Florida to fish. And me? I don't do galas. Too many stiff suits. I prefer the park." Lydia laughed. "Well, I owe you a lunch, at least a sandwich." "You owe me nothing," Arthur said, his eyes twinkling behind his thick glasses. "Watching Holloway get dragged out in cuffs on the 6 o'clock news? That was payment enough for me. I hated that guy." He gestured with his pretzel toward the gleaming gold sign. "Sterling Capital. Strong name. Honest." "It feels heavy," Lydia confessed, her voice dropping so only he could hear. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just becoming another version of them, another suit in a tower." Arthur shook his head. "No, you're different." "How do you know?" "Because you walked through the rain to talk to an old man eating a pretzel," Arthur said. "Richard would have sent security to shoo me away." He adjusted his flat cap. "You did good, Lydia. You didn't just survive. You evolved. Now go inside. You're getting wet, and you've got an empire to run." "Thank you, Arthur," she whispered. He gave her a thumbs up and turned, limping slowly away down 6th Avenue, disappearing into the grey city mist like a guardian angel who had finished his shift. Lydia stood there for a moment, breathing in the smell of rain and exhaust and victory. Then she turned back to the tower. Frank held the door open. "Good afternoon, Miss Sterling." "Good afternoon, Frank." She walked across the marble lobby, her heels clicking a steady rhythm. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. As the doors slid shut, cutting off the noise of the street, Lydia caught her reflection in the polished brass panel. She didn't see the tired, discarded wife anymore. She saw a woman who had walked through fire and come out made of gold. The elevator began to rise. Lydia Sterling went up, and she didn't look down. And that is how Lydia Sterling turned her darkest moment into her greatest victory. She proved that dignity isn't about what you have in your bank account. It's about knowing exactly who you are, even when the world tries to erase you. Richard thought he could throw her away like trash, but he forgot that diamonds are only found under pressure. What did you think of Lydia's revenge? Was 15 years enough for Richard, or did he deserve worse? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. We post new dramas every Tuesday and Friday. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful who you underestimate.